Racism is a danger to the health of America's economy, according to Atlanta Federal Reserve President Rachelle. Now, Bostic says it's at least partly due to systemic racism and economic inequalities, and it's a, quote, cycle the U.S. Central Bank needs to help end. Analysts say the Federal Reserve is under pressure to diversify its board. It also needs to redefine full employment to include those at the bottom of the economic ladder. Well, there are also calls for use of regulatory tools to encourage more lending to minority communities. Some have criticized boosting lending to the underserved, who may be at higher risk of default. They instead want to focus on using those funds for education. Well, let's get you more perspective now on the U.S. economy and racial disparity. I'm joined live via Skype by Dedrick Asante-Muhammad. He's Chief of Race, Wealth and Community for the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So we saw in a recent essay in response to the killing of George Floyd that the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta's president, Rachelle, says systemic racism is a yoke that drags on the American economy. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, well, I'm really glad that he's come to that recognition. Someone from the Fed is stating that. You know, the racial wealth divide is a huge problem in this country. Median wealth for African Americans is around $3,600, whilst for whites it's about $150,000. For Latinos, median wealth is around $6,000. You can't have a strong middle-class economy where the fastest growing parts of the population are in asset poverty. And I think that fact is what is having the Federal Reserve or different leaders in the Federal Reserve recognize that this asset poverty for communities of color is a drag on the American economy as a whole.
Now, your organization promotes building a just economy. What does that entail, and what role can the Fed play in making that a reality?
Well, you know, the Fed, many people look at the Fed to make sure that inflation goes down, but the Fed also has a mission to advance full employment. So I think, you know, that already has a just economy aspect to it, full employment. And I think, you know, recognizing that we need to have a stronger racial analysis recognizes that we've never had a serious focus on full employment for Black and Latino communities, Black communities in particular. Blacks generally have had twice the unemployment rate of whites for the last 50 years. So if we could really get full employment around 4% or less for African Americans and Latinos, we would have a booming economy.
So since that's part of the Fed's existing mission, but obviously we've seen these themes of systemic racism and economic disparity really pushed to the forefront, do you see the Fed using these themes to really broaden their policy focus to be more inclusive of those on the margins rather than some of this broad aggregate that they tend to focus on? Because everyone's having a very different economic experience exacerbated by the pandemic.
No, that's true. And what I would say is I think, you know, economists as a whole are recognizing, I think the COVID was a great example of this. You can't have a strong society, a strong public health infrastructure if you have people who are very vulnerable. Because when you have a shakeup or in the case of COVID, a public health crisis, all of the weakness in health infrastructure for the disenfranchised actually causes a problem all throughout the country. And the same thing is true economically. Having communities in ongoing asset poverty, economic fragility weakens the economy as a whole. So I'm glad the Fed is recognizing to have a holistic approach, they need to look at particular communities to make sure they're strong.
Now, I want to turn to this popular notion that the wealth difference between white and Black Americans could be closed if they focus more on what's seen as so-called personal responsibility, the way some of these model minorities have perhaps focused on education, family structure, home ownership, reinvesting into their own communities, creating their own banks, etc. What's your take on that assessment?
Yeah, I think that's a completely false narrative. I mean, I think, quote unquote, model minorities, oftentimes particular nationalities of Asian Americans, South Asian, Indian, what have you, we see they're in the strongest economic condition because they are the ones that come in, you know, through immigrant status of fairly elite backgrounds in their native country. It is those, you know, Asian Americans who come here in weak economic situation from their native country usually aren't doing that great here. So, you know, there's no evidence that these personal decisions is what is making African Americans all throughout the country have such weak wealth. I mean, even high-income blacks have radically lower amounts of wealth than high-income whites. So I think and I think any economist who study this, I think will see that.
Now, we have seen some political response to this. Presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden caused something of a stir with his ambitious economic proposal, saying, make racial equity part of the U.S. Federal Reserve's mandate. Is that something the Fed can get behind without being accused of bowing to political pressure, as they've been accused of doing under the Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the only way you could call it bowing to political pressure is because one presidential candidate has said it. But I think, the Fed should say that, as has been stated, that we recognize that it is fundamental to the American economy that large groups of Americans, like African Americans and Latinos, have strong economic security. So as part of our mission to strengthen the economy of the United States, we are going to focus in on those communities. Particularly in this moment, we're recognizing they've never had the proper focus. And so we're going to take this opportunity to do what should have been done generations ago.
All right, we do appreciate your insights. Dedrick Asante-Muhammad there, Chief of Race, Wealth and Community for the National Community Reinvestment Coalition.